On today's episode of Locked On Wild, let's see Matt Boldy be a dog at the World Championships.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, we will discuss the news that Matt Boldy will be part of the U.S. roster for the IIHF Men's World Championship. We'll take a look at the other Wild players representing other countries. We'll also talk about Danila Yurov, who is hoisting the trophy in the KHL here after their season finally finished. My name is Seth Topal, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and just going through some news and notes here for today. We've been kind of trying to bite off some big chunks of what went wrong for the Minnesota Wild this season. So taking a little bit of a break from that to recap some news here today. And I just want to throw out there as well, have a real fun crossover episode coming for you tomorrow. Joe DiBiase of Locked On Sabres joining because he is of a similar mindset to me in the notion of what a captain should bring to the ice. And so should be a fun one tomorrow with Joe. So make sure to tune in for that right away in the morning. So many of you will be listening to this one and then having that in the hopper to follow as well. Obviously, earlier today, Team USA, the IIHF Men's World Championships, announcing the U.S. men's national team, the first 15 players that will be part of that group. And let's just go in alphabetical order for absolutely no reason whatsoever. Matt Boldy, Cole Caulfield, Joel Farabee, Johnny Gaudreau, Luke Cunnin, Dylan Larkin, Shane Pinto, Brady Tkachuk, Trevor Zegras are the forwards, at least right now. On defense, Luke Hughes, Seth Jones, Jake Sanderson, Alex Vlasic, Zach Werenski, and the initial goalie confirmation for Team USA, Alex Lyon. Now, John Hines will be the coach for this team, and obviously 15 players isn't enough to fill a full roster, which means there will be more that will be added in to the ranks. But obviously, Matt Boldy is part of the U.S. men's national team roster. And it's interesting because I've seen a lot of mention on Twitter that this is essentially a huge representation of the 2019 draft class. Because obviously you have Cole Caulfield in the mix. You've got Trevor Zegras in the mix there as well. And so if you will recall, the 2019 NHL draft went like this. You had Jack Hughes, who was taken number 1 overall by the New Jersey Devils. Capo Caco, drafted by the Rangers at number 2. Kirby Dach, drafted 3rd by Chicago. Then it was Bowen Byram, drafted 4th by the Avalanche. Alex Turcotte, drafted by Los Angeles at 5. Moritz Seider, drafted 6th by Detroit. Dylan Cousins, drafted 7 by Buffalo. Philip Broberg, drafted 8th by Edmonton. Trevor Zegras, picked at 9 by the Anaheim Ducks. Vasily Podkolzin, drafted 10 by Vancouver. Victor Soderstrom, drafted 11 by Arizona. And then Matt Boldy at 12, drafted by the Wild. And if you look at the 2019 class, obviously Jack Hughes has the most games at the NHL level for this draft class with 306, just ahead of Capo Caco. He's got 281 points, which paces the 2019 class. You know who is second? Matt Boldy is second on the list. Boldy, 203 games played, and he's got 171 points. That is just ahead of Dylan Cousins, who has 166. Also in the mix, Trevor Zegras with 154. Cole Caulfield drafted 15th by the Montreal Canadiens, and he has 149 points in 203 games. He does have more goals than Boldy with 81, and he actually has the second most goals in the class, but Boldy has 96 assists to just 68 for Caulfield. So Boldy, second leading scorer for that 2019 class, and there will be a lot of it on display for the men's national team coming up here in May. Now, some of the interesting things as far as like what would this lineup look like, at least initially. Obviously, there will be players that will commit to this as their teams are eliminated from the postseason. Looking at this initial roster, obviously you are going to have the likes. You've got Johnny Gaudreau. You've got Brady Tkachuk. Two tremendous players that are definitely going to be in the top six. Trevor Zegras, I would imagine, will be your 1C. So the question then becomes, do you go Boldy, Zegras, Tkachuk, then Caulfield? You've got Shane Pinto in the mix. You've got Luke Cunnin in the mix as well. Do we see Boldy as a one or as a top line guy or a second line guy, at least in this initial roster release? The more players that get added in, it's very likely that he gets slotted down in the lineup. But I wouldn't mind Boldy getting a little time to chum it up with Brady Tkachuk. Not in the slightest, because that's a guy, as we'll talk about more tomorrow. I know it's a pipe dream. I know. I'm aware it's a pipe dream, but I'm just gonna dream right through it. It's a guy that certainly has an edge to his play while also having a tremendous amount of skill. So that's one thing that I would like to see. But the other thing that I honestly would like to see from Matt Boldy in the World Championship is don't just be a guy. Don't just be part of the group. Be one of the drivers. You've got a lot of talent on this roster, and this is a great opportunity for Boldy to kind of take the reins, take the lead here in this. Now, obviously, as I mentioned, you've got Gaudreau, you've got Tkachuk, but there certainly is no reason that Boldy can't be one of the top options on this initial roster, depending on who else gets slotted in. I want to see him do more than just be part of the team. Just be one of the guys. Like, be a contributor, be somebody that the other rosters in this tournament have to take note of. That would be a nice way to get the offseason started. Maybe use a little bit of that frustration, that fire from the fact that the season didn't go the way that anybody hoped it would. Use a little bit of that. Let a little bit of that frustration out here in May while it's still fresh. And just be one of the noticeable players. And I'll be keeping an eye as much as possible. So, and don't tell me too, with John Hines being the head coach, Don't tell me that Boldy is not going to get those particular opportunities, depending on who else is on the roster. If you have a top 6 with obvious guys, then yeah, he's going to get slotted lower in the lineup. But if the opportunity is there for him to play a meaningful role on this team, take it, run with it. Don't look back. Just be a pain out there. I would love nothing more than that. So that's my hope for Boldy at the Worlds, which will be in Czechia in May from the 10th through the 26th. Just be a dog out there. That's all I'm looking for. If Boldy is able to do that, that's going to get my offseason started on a great note. Now, there are other players for the Minnesota Wild that are going to be taking part in this tournament. So we'll talk about those names. We'll talk about a notable omission for Team USA. Brock Faber opting not to. We'll tell you why, and we'll tell you what that sets up for Faber. That's all coming up here on today's episode of Locked On Wild. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you will always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it is easy to make your car the MVP and bring home the win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Today's episode of Locked On Wild also brought to you by FanDuel. Playoffs are in full swing for the NBA, the NHL, Major League Baseball off and running as well, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every single game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. My best advice, since it is win or lose, throw down on the Minnesota Twins if you are in a state in which you can. And then you've got $150 to throw on all of your favorite non-Minnesota Wild teams in the Stanley Cup playoffs. NBA playoffs as well. You got a lot of options and a lot of opportunities to make this a great end to the month of April. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and super easy to use. So what are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Listeners, it is finally here. Tomorrow, the NFL Draft will get underway with the first round. We'll find out finally who the Minnesota Vikings are going to take as their quarterback of the future, if they're going to make that big trade, or if they're just going to hang out at number 11 and see who falls. But you can get an inside scoop as to how the first round could potentially go with the Locked On NFL Mock Draft. You can find the Locked On NFL Mock Draft, the 6-episode series detailing every single pick and who our local Locked On experts think will go to each franchise, plus the fantasy football angle as well. We know you are big in fantasy football, so we've got you covered there as well. Locked On NFL Mock Draft is now available on the Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. As Michael Russo notes, some other names that are going to be part of the Worlds include Joel Eriksson Ek, Jonas Brodin, Jesper Wallstedt, and Philip Gustafsson for Sweden. Matt Zuccarello for Norway, and Marco Rossi for Austria as well. Russo also noting that there could be more or less. The number is obviously not set in stone here yet. There is one notable player for Team USA that will not be making the rounds. Brock Faber, who obviously with his rib injury, fractured ribs that he played the final 2 months of the season with, still insane to me that he did that. He obviously is focusing on the season ahead because Faber knows he is primed for a big season for a few reasons. Number one, looming contract extension. And so if Faber plays another season like he just had, and it's funny as well because you look at his numbers before the injury. Like if you look at what Faber did in the months leading up to the injury, he was absurdly good. There was a notable dip in his performance. For instance, I'm not 100% sure how it works, but I did see the player cards shared that looked at like a bunch of different factors, including the percentage of your wins above replacement that you actually hit. And Brock Faber was operating at a 94% of his projected wins above replacement through pre-injury. Post-injury, it was down to about 36%. So that is obviously something that really hampered him. And just looking at what he did pre-injury, if we go from October 10th and stop the simulation at February 29th, Brock Faber had 34 points in 60 games. He was a +1 in that span. 34 points in 60 games. If you go from March 1st to the end of the season, his numbers obviously took a bit of a dip. Faber in that metric, he had 13 points in 22 games. He was a -2 though. And obviously his defensive metrics took a bit of a tumble as well. Point of the story, Faber not playing in the Worlds because he wants to prime himself for a big payday. And more importantly, a big season. And I don't fault him for that because as good as we view Brock Faber's season, and it was a dandy of a season, he holds himself to a much higher standard. We'll talk about that a little bit more tomorrow in our crossover with Joe DiBiase of Locked On Sabres. He holds himself to a much higher standard, which is something that I hope rubs off on a large majority of the rest of the team. But obviously, the other players that will be taking part in the Worlds could have a massive impact. Joel Eriksson Ek, Jonas Brodin, Jesper Wallstedt, and Philip Gustafsson. Those are big gets for Sweden. Matt Zuccarello will probably be one of the more standout players for Norway. And same thing with Marco Rossi, because the hits have not been as big for those two countries. So obviously you've got a lot of players that play over there anyway. So those two being players that got to the NHL, they'll be standouts on this team that will be filled by many European players for the tournament. So it all comes down to Team USA versus Team Canada. It always does. And that will be no exception here for this tournament as well. So that's just a little update on the Wild players at this point that will be playing in the World Championships next month. So Matt Boldy, the most notable, but still plenty of others that will be taking part as well. One member of the Minnesota Wild organization able to hoist some hardware here this postseason over in the KHL. We'll talk about Danila Yurov hoisting the cup as we finish today's episode of Locked on Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is brought to you by Sleeper. The NHL postseason is in action, and even though the Minnesota Wild are not playing right now, you can still win big by playing daily fantasy hockey on Sleeper, the official daily fantasy app of the Locked On NHL Network. Sleeper is our number one choice for daily fantasy sports, and especially daily fantasy hockey, because with Sleeper, you can win 100 times your cash in daily fantasy hockey contests. All you have to do is pick whether elite players, McDavid, Ovechkin, Crosby, McKinnon. Crosby, the only one that is not currently in the big dance, but McDavid, McKinnon, Ovechkin, they can bring you plenty of value. All you got to do is pick whether those players will record more or less than their Sleeper projections in categories such as goals, assists, saves, plus, minus, and more in a given game. No worries about a time crunch. It can take less than 60 seconds to set your lineup, and you can also talk amongst a group. If you've got a group of friends that are all playing, you can connect via the group or team chat functionality right in the app. Ultimate levels of smack talk when your picks are put in. Use promo code LOCKEDONNHL and you'll get up to a $100 match on your first deposit. Terms and conditions apply. That's code LOCKEDONNHL. See Sleeper's terms of use for details and locational availability. Today's episode of Locked on Wild is also brought to you by Indeed. When you're drafting your fantasy team, do you ever wish you could handpick the best stars for your business team? If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. Indeed is the hiring platform where you can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. Don't spend hours on multiple job sites looking for candidates with the right skills when you can do it all with Indeed. Candidates you invite to apply through Instant Match are 3 times more likely to apply to your job than candidates who only see it in search, according to U.S. Indeed data. And get this, in the 60 seconds we've been talking, 16 hires were made on Indeed, according to Indeed data worldwide. Indeed knows when you're growing your own business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/lockedon to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Final segment of today's episode of Locked on Wild. Once again, we thank you for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, make sure to join us tomorrow. We've got a fun crossover for you with Joe DiBiase of Locked on Sabres. The Buffalo Sabres obviously making a pretty big move here recently, bringing Lindy Ruff back to be head coach. We'll talk a little bit about that, but we will also talk about leadership. So should be a fun one. And we'll also talk about Minnesota and Buffalo, 2 cities that have similar levels of not playoff success. Speaking of playoff success, Danila Yurov and his team in the KHL are the Gagarin Cup champions. After they finished the season, Yurov, that is, finished the job, and Yurov's performance himself not too bad. Metalurg beat Locomotive 4-0 to sweep the series and take home the cup. Yurov had 7 shots, 3 of them on goal. He was also 3 of 8 in the faceoff circle, had 1 block and 3 hits. So now what? Because Danila Yurov's season is over. Is he going back to KHL? Is he coming here? What gives? What's going on? What's happening? Well, according to Michael Russo, at this point, it sounds like the team is not optimistic that he is going to be headed here this season, unfortunately. Sorry, Wild fans. I want to see him as much as you do, but it seems like this has always been the outcome to this, that Yurov was always going to head back over to the KHL for one more season, because let's remember some of the reasoning behind this. Well, number one, money. He can make far more in the KHL than he can in the NHL. And opportunity. Because as much as I would like to just pick him and plant him in the top 6 for next season, he gets the opportunity to be one of the top players. He led his team in scoring in the KHL. He gets an opportunity to do it one more time at the KHL level and then make his way over here. But what does this mean? I think, based on reading the tea leaves, I think this probably means that we see him go a similar route that we saw Marat Huznadinov go, in that he will likely burn a year of his ELC once his KHL season is over. Now, if the KHL season goes longer than the Minnesota Wild season does, because let's not forget, Marat Huznadinov was able to get here because his KHL team was atrocious. Like, the day after the season was done, everything was wrapped up and his contract was terminated. He was on his way here. Like, the timeline of events to make that happen was incredibly quick. If Metalurg gets to the postseason and the Wild don't, then the burning a year doesn't factor in, because then he would just sign an ELC and he'd be with the team the following season. I'm super tantalized, though, by the fact of Yurov coming in and just taking one of those spots in the top 6, because Bill Guerin said it. Until I see it play out, though, I'm going to remain hesitant. But he has said in multiple spots, because he mentioned it, he talked about it with Judd Zulgad on Judd's Hockey Show, this notion of, if these young guys start to pick it up, like if these young guys impress and play their way into top spots, we can't be hesitant to move the vets out of their way. Great notion to have. That's how it should be. That's how it should be in any walk of life. If you've got a youngster that is now, other than, there are some exceptions, I'm sure, but if you've got youngsters that are outpacing the more veteran people that currently occupy that spot, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage to not make the switch. And if we look at the roster situation, if Cap Friendly will allow it, if they'll let me take a peek, it just feels like the natural baton handoff is Marcus Johansson. Now, again, I'm in favor of just being done with that tenure. I saw enough. We all did. We all saw enough of the Marcus Johansson tenure this past season to just want to be completely done with it. Doesn't seem like the team feels that same way. So what we're likely going to get is Johansson plays out the year, and then Yurov takes that roster spot next season. Now, could I be wrong? Sure. But just read that. That's what I do, folks. I read the tea leaves. I see the information. I hear stuff from other shows. Just kind of try to connect the dots. I read the tea leaves and react to it. That's how I see this playing out. I'd be way more in favor of just taking the ripcord on the parachute and just letting it rip and just finding a way. Now, what I hope at the least will happen is that Johansson is not in the top 6. I don't see a way that you can justify that. Like, we're all ready to just cut the cord right now. But at the very least, cannot be in the top 6. That's a non-starter. So it looks like, and again, it is interesting to me that it seems like Russo and Joe Smith are kind of taking different approaches to this. Joe Smith has been holding out hope that Yurov would elect to come here. Russo has been pretty adamant that it's not going to happen this year. I guess there's a chance, but it seems like that ship is starting to push away from the harbor. So that is today's show. Again, reminder, tomorrow we've got a fun crossover for you. Locked on Wild, Locked on Sabres. We're talking leadership and just about surviving Minnesota sports and Buffalo sports. So should be a lot of fun. Hope you enjoy it. Make sure you like and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes here on Locked on Wild. Later this week, little nugget that has been making the rounds on Twitter as Russo in the latest Worst Seats on the House, talking about how it seems likely that the Wild will try to add, yes, I know, punch your wall, a top 6 player to the mix this offseason. So we'll look at possibilities there. Again, y'all know where I stand on this. I just would much rather see resources allocated elsewhere or just allocated from within. But we'll take a look at the names that could potentially fit the bill to fill a spot that was just a anemic black hole all season in the top 6. So that's our show today. Thanks for tuning in. As always, appreciate every single person that takes the time to listen, takes the time to interact via on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram, on Discord, or in the YouTube comments as well. I appreciate every single one of you that helped make this Locked on Wild community what it is today. So make sure you subscribe and follow on your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on any future episodes of Locked on Wild. You can find new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.